For this part of the conversation to a close, Harry, would any of those fighters be candidates for you?
Berg is certainly right up there with the contenders for me.
All right, from your point of view, Frank, the early contenders?
Jimmy Wilde and Jack Kidd Berg.
Okay, and Glenn?
I think Ted Kid Lewis. Very much. In the early part, he stands out a little more than the rest to me.
All right, so that draws things together from the early years of this century. One or two candidates put forward by our team here. I have to say they've been pretty cruel on the bigger men from the bigger weight divisions, but the lighter weights have certainly had a shout already. We'll see you again in just a moment. Bye for now. Hello again. We've taken a stroll through the early years of this century of British boxing history in the company of Frank Warren, Glenn McCrory and Harry Mullen. And Harry, we got as far as the outbreak of the Second World War, but in that period leading up to the war, there was a flyweight champion in this country, Benny Lynch. Does he deserve to be in contention here as we try to pick the best British boxer of all time?
Lynch certainly does. I mean, Lynch is one of those rare fighters from that era that you can see would live with the best that we've got to offer in the modern era. He was a fighter of pure quality, but also he had a tragic self-destruct instinct. He was an incurable alcoholic, and within 6 years of having his last fight, he was dying in a gutter in Glasgow. I mean, he's one of the great tragedies of British boxing. But had he had discipline, he could have reigned for 10 years probably on the ability that he'd got.
So boxing in the professional sense didn't provide him with a lifestyle that he could escape from the problems. He was dragged down by his problems.
No, he couldn't escape. It's the old thing of taking the man out of the ghetto, but not the ghetto out of the man. Well, in Benny's case, it was the Gorbals. You know, he was drawn back into the Gorbals and couldn't escape them.
Frank, I know this is a subject close to your heart. It's the best thing about this game, surely, is when you see a man given opportunities that he would not otherwise get through boxing and actually making something of his life.
That's right. I mean, it happens to the lucky few. Some of them just can't handle the fame, though. And Benny Lynch was one of those guys, which was, as Harry was saying, it's a terrible tragedy for British boxing and indeed for himself. But he's got to go down as being one of the greats. I mean, you've got to remember him for his boxing, not for his shortcomings or his failings as a person.
What about him as a box office attraction in the 30s? Was he a true star?
He was a true star, and he was. You know, they'd done great business with him in those days. He was a great attraction.
So when he fought Peter Kane, he drew something like 50,000 people to a football ground in Glasgow. So unimaginable that flyweights could draw that kind of gate nowadays.
Yes, I suppose there's no chance. Unless you've got somebody
I'll
keep it under wraps.
I'll tell you about him later.
Glenn, when you look back to this era of boxing, are you glad you were a fighter in the 1980s and 90s rather than in the hungry 20s and 30s?
I think it would have been a far more exciting time, and also it was a time when, because TV wasn't there, you could also lose and it wasn't brought up and thrown in your face all the time. So you could have your little loss in some little town and then you could just get back onto your business, where now you're very much underneath the glamour and the light, and there's so much more pressure on you if you lose, and almost everybody TV writes you off if there's a loss, where it was so different then. You could just get on with it, you get lost in one town, then you're back fighting the next one. It didn't really make no difference. So along the line, your greatness would tell.
It's a good point, that, because I mean, we're talking about Benny Lynch. There were 32 fights Benny had which he didn't win. He lost 15 and drew 17. But they were all part of his learning process, and just because he lost the odd fight, nobody said, oh, he's finished. I mean, where, God forbid, Naz Ahmed to get beaten in a fight, the public would be saying the guy's finished and he can't fight and so on, which is rubbish. I mean, a loss is just part of the routine learning experience of a fighter, which the pressures of and the publicity that modern fighters have to cope with doesn't allow them to have. But it was routine in Benny Lynch's day.
Harry, in the eyes of many good judges, I don't know if you'd concur with this, Sugar Ray Robinson was perhaps certainly a serious candidate for finest pound-for-pound boxer in the world ever. But one of Britain's stars of the 40s and 50s actually beat him.
And got me into boxing, coincidentally. That was the very first time that I ever became aware of boxing, when I was, I think, 5 years old at the time, and was allowed to stay up late to listen to the commentary on Randall Turpin against Sugar Ray Robinson. I mean, that fight, it's hard to grasp at this distance the impact that it had on Britain. I mean, we were just coming out of the Second World War, and it was a very grey, depressed, gloomy sort of time. And then Robinson turned up with an entourage of, I don't know, 25 or something, and a pink Cadillac and a barber and the whole thing. I mean,
a dwarf,
he brought fun to the sport.
A tame dwarf.
Yeah, a tame dwarf. And
Wild.
But Robinson had a utterly incredible record. He'd lost at that stage 1 out of 123 fights, and nobody seriously gave Randy Turpin a chance. I mean, Turpin was a decent fighter certainly, but no one thought that he could possibly beat Sugar Ray Robinson. But he did, and he beat him fair and square and beat him on merit.
How great an achievement does it look to you, Glenn, with the
Well, I think
benefit of history?
you've got to put that upon one of the great achievements that there was in boxing, because Sugar Ray Robinson, you know, almost to a man will go down as one of the greatest fighters of all time. And he almost did it a second time. He did it a first time at home, where you maybe thought that Robinson had his entourage and came in there and wasn't particularly serious, and you know, was fighting here, there and everywhere, and you know, so there could be an excuse that Robinson wasn't right up for it. But the second time, Robinson had went back, he prepared, he got straight back home, and he wanted to win so much. And Turpin was giving him a real go until Robinson produced a tremendous flurry. Turpin had him cut and in terrible bother, until Robinson came out and showed what made him probably the greatest fighter of all time.
Was that his finest hour, Frank?
I think it was. It was his finest hour without a doubt, and it was one of the great performances in British boxing. But I think Robinson was the Ken Norton of his time when Ali fought Norton.
Turpin was the Ken Norton.
Was the Ken Norton, and I think he was the Ali always had troubles with Ken Norton. I think that Robinson would always have trouble with Turpin. Turpin, great performance, but I don't think he goes down in my book as one of the
Because of the overall record.
overall records. What you got to look at
Yeah, it's a case of a fighter heading perfection for one night in his career, and we have to judge him on more than one night.
One of the British fighters from this period, still a much-loved man in British boxing circles, Henry Cooper, had a special night. He didn't quite get the famous result.
Well, he came pretty close.
But he came as close as you can come against Cassius Clay, as he then was.
With another 10 seconds in the round, he may well have changed.
How good
the
a
whole course
fighter
of
was
history.
Henry Cooper for you, Harry?
On his night, he was a great fighter, but I mean, he was a small heavyweight. We have to remember that. Henry rarely weighed more than 13.5 stone. I mean, he would barely have been a cruiserweight in today's terms. And he was found wanting at top level. I mean, he lost to quite a lot of fairly second division Americans. I mean, people like Roger Richer and Amos Johnson, and guys that you wouldn't expect, with people that aren't even remembered nowadays, did beat Cooper. So he was a great fighter by British standards and even by European standards, but he fell short at world level.
Glenn?
Yes, I think you've got to agree with that, because of the boxers that beat him. He had a wonderful night, and he'll be remembered for that, and he was a great ambassador. But I think if we look at world level, you know, we've got to sort of rule Henry out of this list.
He was great for British boxing. The point Harry makes about him being a small heavyweight, you know, at the time, Cassius Clay was the Olympic light heavyweight champion. He wasn't a big guy when he fought Cooper. I don't think there was a big weight difference. Of course, went on to become a big heavyweight. But I think Henry was a good European, good British fighter, world level. He just didn't do it. And I think at one time he had to leave this, or he left this country to box in Germany. He lost about 4 or 5 on the trot, and he had to re-establish his career in Germany. He's remembered for decking one of the greatest, and I think that's great accolade for him. But he doesn't get on my list.
No, I think he's remembered more for his personality than for his actual achievements.
Well, he was a good,
in the
I
ring.
mean, I think he was a much better fighter than a lot of people give him credit for. But he's certainly not one of our greats.
There's nothing wrong with losing 4 or 5 on a run. I must add. I've been being there myself.
Frank's strictly applying the letter of this law that you have to have been a serious contender.
Well, he didn't do it,
At
did he?
world
At
level.
world level, he didn't do it. And I remember there's a famous quote at the time from his manager, Jim Wicks, who was one of the great managers of British boxing, who said he wouldn't let him fight Sonny Liston. He wouldn't even let him, not in the same ring, but the same town. And if you're going to be a champion, you've got to fight the best. And they kept him away from Sonny Liston. And I think that must be remembered.
Few weight differences, weight classes different, but how about Dave Charnley from a similar period?
I think Dave Charnley is, Ernie Fossey, who's my matchmaker, rates him as the best British fighter since the war. Unfortunately, Dave never won a title. I never see Dave fight, but again, you know, he was and has a reputation of being a great fighter, but didn't do it when it came to world level.
Well, I think he was unfortunate to be a contemporary of Joe Brown, who was one of the best lightweight champions, world lightweight champions of all time. And Charnley, in the opinion of a lot of ringsiders, did enough to beat him in London in their second fight. He was stopped in cuts the first time, but the second fight, a lot of people believe that Charnley did enough to get the verdict. It went Brown's way, but and Charnley, for me, was one of the great, I wouldn't dispute Derny Fossey's assessment at all, one of the great post-war British fighters.
How difficult was it at that